welcome everyone. My name is Ramesh. I'm part of public engagement team at Biodiversity Collaborative. Just before we start, just a couple of housekeeping announcements. Please keep yourselves on mute. If you have any questions, type it out in the Q&A box, and we will curate them at the end during our Q&A session. This meeting is being recorded and live streamed. Once again, welcome. Today's session is second in our Biodiversity is Us Roundtable series. We believe that biodiversity is intrinsically linked to human well-being. However, there are aspects of biodiversity where we have somehow created contradiction. And one such contradiction is, can India be biodiverse while we feed the nation? Intuitively, it does not even seem like a question. However, our policies since Green Revolution and on-ground realities, the two priorities seem to be pitted against each other. Due to various socio-political reasons, we are prioritizing a chemical-heavy monocultures at the cost of biodiversity. But does it have to be this way? What could be alternative pathways? And can they be implemented at scale? What do different stakeholders think about this? To unpack this, today we have a set of people who have been deeply engaging with this issue at the level of policy making, scientific research, and also socio-economic action on ground. I'm really looking forward for a lively discussion. And without further ado, I would like to welcome our first panelist, Kavitha Kuruganti, a well-known social activist and advocate for farmers' rights and sustainable farm livelihoods. She has been one of the most prominent voices on the issues such as GMO introduction, chemical farming, fertilizer subsidies, and she has a deep understanding on the challenges that our farmers face today. Kavita, I feel agroecology is both science and a movement, isn't it? And therefore, we would like to hear from you about on-ground reality of what does food security look like in India today? And is it compatible or at odds with biodiversity? Over to you, Kavita.
Thank you. I hope I'm audible. You can hear me, right?
We can hear you right, Kavita. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So I guess the question really is, if India is not biodiverse, can it continue to feed its people? And I think every panelist is going to dwell on that bit for sure. And I have some 7-8 things to raise in the context of how biodiversity and food security, which has to be necessarily conceptualized as nutrition security, how they are interrelated and they cannot be pitted against each other. They are not pitted against each other. But let's go back a bit to Green Revolution that you were talking about. And we certainly went wrong big time in India when we assumed that feeding people is all about 2 grains, rice and wheat. And we went seriously wrong with our policy approach, where we thought that with these 2 grains that can be produced in just small islands in the country, which are the Green Revolution pockets, in large quantities with great emphasis on productivity and yields, that food security can be achieved. And in the process, we also depend on imported fertilizers, even as we call ourselves food secure and so on. And in this conceptualization of food security that this country had run on for decades now, we have destroyed those areas where Green Revolution was established, as well as rain-fed areas. And in the end, we have a situation where diverse food systems, which necessarily mean diverse cropping, diverse varieties, and so on. And diverse food systems is not just about even cultivated crops. Diverse food systems is also about forests as food producing habitats, for instance, where they become food producing habitats only when they are not monocultures. We have decimated all of this, and we have cut the continuum between the food cultures, agriculture, forest, nature, and so on. And farming practices and outcomes have certainly affected not just crop biodiversity, but larger biodiversity, and nutrition security is a major problem now. And we can't talk about feeding people without, placing on the table nutrition security as a real issue. And there I want to bring up the second point that I want to make, which is that of One Health. And most people here are familiar with soil health being closely related to plant nutrition closely related to human health. And what do we do to soil health and plant nutrition is closely linked to planetary health itself. And when we talk about nutrition security, we've got to look at a One Health concept, which is about on-ground diversity of crops and varieties. And it is that diversity which actually adds to soil nutrition. Soil health cannot be created otherwise. You just certainly need diverse, on-ground diversity, which necessarily means under the ground root systems and so on, and microbiological diversity, and that is linked to soil health. And several of you would be familiar with the fact that National Institute of Nutrition has done an analysis of food composition tables, something like 528 food items, which were compared, which were studied once in 1989 and later in 2017. And the overall picture of what's happening to our foods, other than diversity declining, is that for the same kind of food item, the nutritional quality is actually deteriorating. And analysis shows that it is linked to at least three reasons. One is soil health, soils not having all kinds of nutrients that are required. Two, it is about what varieties are used for farming, especially the vast agrodiversity that used to exist, and how cropping itself was about mixed cropping, intercropping in any crop that you take in India earlier, before the so-called Green Revolution intensive paradigm came. And thirdly, related to climate change and what greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are doing to, the biochemical composition of plants that we cultivate. So we have to be aware of the fact that all of these are linked. And I also want to flag the point that we need to talk about resilience, and resilience from a farm livelihoods perspective, as well as a food security, nutrition security perspective, actually comes from diversity-based farming, especially in the age of climate change. And when a farm household's economics are affected because you don't have resilience in your food production system, that farm households' food security, as well as when you aggregate it up at the country level, the national food security, all of this depends on diversity-based farming. And that brings us to the story of what has happened to traditional cultivars, farmers' land races, folk varieties, farmers' varieties, and so on. Where have they disappeared, and why has agrodiversity eroded so much in the country? The why reason is clear. The entire policy ecosystem around Green Revolution has actually favored so-called high-yielding cultivars, and breeding was done in exclusion of any other parameter focusing on productivity. And that productivity was achieved through external chemical inputs, as well as water and irrigation being provided. But today, if you look at trying to revive crop diversity, it is both, it obviously has many, many positive reasons why it has to be revived, but it has huge challenges. Farmers themselves don't want to grow many crops as well as many varieties within crops because a negative narrative has been spread about these varieties. The policy tools that are deployed around seed replacement rates, as they are called, every agriculture department reports itself on SRRs that it achieved year after year. All of these are tuned towards reducing diversity and promoting only few varieties. So even the physical access to diverse seeds is simply a major problem today. There are no well-functioning seed production systems for such varieties. And we need to take a full food systems approach if we want to revive crop diversity and varietal diversity, because unless you work with consumers and unless you work with food enterprises, where food enterprises have to encourage both consumers and producers about why diversity is important. To consumers, you've got to show the nutritional superiority of the traditional land races, which they are. A lot of studies have already shown through vast scientific body of literature. But you've got to encourage consumers in their own enlightened self-interest to pay higher to farmers. And you need farmers to appreciate the greater resilience that these land races give to them, other than maybe profitability if markets are created. And in between, there's a whole host of issues to be addressed, including processing technologies and so on and so forth. And there are some strange legal and even so-called scientific obstacles that come in the way in terms of reviving that diversity. For instance, India's Protection of Plant Varieties and Farmers' Rights Act, which is a very unique, progressive, sui generis legislation globally, it actually excludes even government agencies and other farming communities from bringing into their seed production systems registered farmers' varieties without the authorization of the registrant. So what was a common resource has been made into a privatized commodity in a so-called legislative framework, which basically tried to comply with the WTO TRIPS agreement, even though it incorporated farmers' rights as a exclusive stream within the statute. And these registrants include even single individual farmers who are coming in the way of entire communities and public sector agencies, readily multiplying and supplying traditional seed cultivars. Similarly, under the Seeds Act 1966 of India, seed certification standards and standards related to uniformity, DUS standards that are applied to traditional cultivars, those are also legal obstacles that are coming in the way. And I'll end by saying two things. One is, we cannot not talk about corporations and corporatized agriculture that comes in the way of biodiversity and agrodiversity, specifically addressing nutrition security. That requires a full webinar in itself, but the legal tools, the technological tools, including hybridization, including transgenics and so on, policy tools and market tools that corporations use are really coming in the way of agrobiodiversity being regenerated and revived. And India's seed policy is exclusively about privatized seed sector. From the 80s itself, much before India formally accepted liberalization and privatization and globalization as its policies, seed sector got privatized. And you can well imagine that companies prefer only a few varieties that they can sell across India, that too high value, low volume crops, transaction costs being low, and yield continues to be the main USP. And the very fact that they don't want competition out there means that they don't want diversity out there. So they decimate competition, they decimate diversity, even within so-called high-yielding varieties and so on. So let's accept that a corporate approach to agriculture in itself is a very, very big threat to agrodiversity. And the last point that I want to make, some may call it as my pet peeve. I am known as a GM-free campaigner for India. I do want to talk about GM crops, especially herbicide-tolerant crops. And I think we have to remember that Brazil is a good example in front of us, where large-scale landscape level changes, including of the Amazonian rainforest, have happened. Destruction of large scale of biodiversity because of large-scale adoption, unregulated adoption of this technology called GM technology and herbicide-tolerant crops. And India has just approved a herbicide-tolerant GM mustard. Any HT trait means that mixed cropping and diversity-based cropping goes for a toss. So if we want to protect biodiversity, we've got to stop transgenics. And I also want to talk about genome editing as part of the gene technologies in agriculture, which are destroying. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Kavita. We are slightly over time, but that's all right because the insights were so useful. But I would now like to welcome Devendra Sharma, a distinguished food and trade policy analyst, an award-winning journalist, writer, thinker, and researcher. In his own unique ways, he analyzes international development with local interpretation. Taking forward from where Kavita left off, Devendraji, if you could, we would like to hear from you, what is the current policy landscape moving away from, is it moving away from green revolution? What are some of the practices and policies governments should ensure for having a biodiverse and a food secure future?
Well, thank you, Nimisha. When I was a young student, I remember I began researching or part of the graduation program when the Green Revolution was almost there. And at that particular time, I used to ask a question, and the question still remains relevant. The question was that when we go for increasing productivity, when we go on saying that productivity is very important, very crucial to feed the nation, as a plant breeder, we know that when the productivity goes up, there is an inversely proportionate decline in nutrition. So when you raise productivity, yes, the quantity increases, but the nutrition goes down. So I always used to ask my professors, why are we not focusing on nutrition? The answer I would get is, oh, you better forget about nutrition because we have to feed the hungry stomachs. Now, that was one argument that was flashed at that time, and that narrative built up, and we all tend to agree that, yes, feeding the population was very important. Secondly, if you look at rice as a one of the important crops that we take care of, there are about 120,000 rice varieties globally. We know that the genetic base has narrowed down to just 6 varieties today. Now that tells us the importance of or the lack of what we have ignored all these years. The importance of what we have ignored all these years. If we are focusing on the genetic base, resource base, or concentrating only on 6 crop varieties. And the entire research programs globally is being designed or fed on that particular base. So it tells us very clearly how narrow the genetic base has come down to. And especially in the context of the role that agrobiodiversity plays and the diversity that exists in this country, massive as far as we know, paddy is concerned and so on for other crops, look at what we have lost in transition as far as we move on in the game or the race towards higher productivity. And of course, we know we are moving from that green revolution era to now at the new stage where genetic modification and gene editing takes place, and eventually we will see digital technology and artificial intelligence, the drones and so on, concentrating or taking control. Power gets into the hands of few conglomerates. That is what the world is moving towards increasingly in the days to come. Now, these two instances I want to illustrate because over the years, we have ignored that nutritional security aspect. And then, of course, we think that fortification of rice may be the best way to bring in that nutrition back into a human population. That is one way of doing it. But in any case, if we had focused on and taking adequate care of our biodiversity, perhaps this problem would not have arisen in the first instance. Also, we should know that over the last so many years, the kind of research paradigm that the country has focused on essentially has led to the kind of debacle that we see not only in India, but also globally. We know that agriculture globally is responsible for about 34% of the greenhouse gas emissions, and much of it is because of the kind of intensive farming that takes place. And whether it is Holland, or whether it is England, or now New Zealand, and so on, there is a war against farmers in the developed world today. And that means that increasingly we are asking farmers to get out of agriculture because they have done already a lot of damage to the environment. So the lessons here is perhaps, to move those, the populations or the farming populations from the intensive farming system that we have gone into and go to or come to more agro-diverse and agroecological farming systems. Now, this will bring in both, try to ensure that you are nutritionally taken care of. At the same time, it will ensure that the food security and based on food sovereignty is the way forward, as has been amply demonstrated globally. In this particular scenario, the argument is that we cannot do without these high-yielding varieties or this kind of agriculture, the intensive agriculture, if we have to really feed the country. Your broader question, I think, was very important because that is what is something that is being challenged. The moment you talk about agrobiodiversity, the moment you talk about agroecology, there is a kind of a voice that erupts and which starts to say, no, we have to feed the hungry population. So therefore, we need intensive farming to take place. Even in the European Union, where under the Common Agriculture Policy, a massive allocation has been made this time for agroecological farming system. There is again an opposition there saying that we will lose our food security status, or we will lose our status to feed our own population. But there are ample studies in European Union which tell us that if we were to move to agroecological farming system, by 2050, Europe would have enough food to take care of. It would even have surplus to export to those needy countries and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is the dominant thinking or the dominant narrative that has been built over the years is that you cannot move away from the high-yielding varieties or the green revolution kind of pattern that we have evolved over the years. Now, interestingly, in India, which has a huge population of hungry, we have the second largest population of hungry in the world after Nigeria, and which means about 200 million people roughly are nutritionally insecure or nutritionally poor. And in that condition, we have a surplus of food grain stocks, and which we believe we need to really increase our food surpluses. But the recent developments that we have seen in our country tells me, is it really food security that we are trying to focus on to increase our productivity or increase our production? If you look at it, a big conference held yesterday, and which many newspapers have devoted full pages today to talk about how important biofuels is. I'm surprised that in a country where, as I said earlier, the second largest population of hungry people live, and where we talk of food security, actually we have started diverting food to feed the cars. A bigger program has been launched in India or is also in the progress. We have seen roughly about 2 lakh tons of rice being diverted for ethanol blending in this country. And we also know that in addition to rice, sugarcane and maize are the other crops that are the focus of diversion towards feeding the cars rather than feeding the human population. Now, if this is a situation that is developing, parallel to what has already happened in America and the European Union. We know in America, about 80 million tons of food grains are diverted for ethanol production. In European Union, about 12 million tons are diverted for ethanol production. And then we talk about food security. I think whose food security are we talking about? This is the bigger policy question that the country should be now debating, given the diversion that is taking place, moving food from the mouths of the hungry people into, trying to see that the automobile tank, fuel tank is full. So I think this is a bigger picture that we are now moving into, or a direction that we are moving into. And I think it relates to the kind of fear that was created earlier that, if you don't go in for that kind of farming system, you will not be able to feed the population. Now, we have done that. And we have seen that, yes, we have a surplus also, but if the food is being diverted to cars, I think the question that comes up is why not, in the context of the climate emergency that the world is in, why can't we ensure that we at least take the first step to move into agroecological farming systems, to move into biodiverse agriculture in this country, to ensure that, the people, especially the small scale farmers, considering that India has 86% farmers who have a land holding of less than 5 acres. I think what is more peculiar, or what could be a kind of a guiding spirit for India, would be that we have to move away from this kind of a system to the kind of system that you are trying to tell us, that we can move on to agrobiodiversity. And then one last point that I would like to make before I stop here is that please let us not be worried when policymakers tell us that, yes, in a country like India, what we need is to ensure food security for this country. I think the country has already given up on that, or perhaps realizes that it is no use feeding the hungry, and we should now move towards more of a commercial application of the kind of food that we produce. Why is this worrisome? I think is because when the Bengal famine happened in 1943, we know 30 lakh people died or perished in that Bengal famine. And we also know there was no shortfall in production that particular year. The British government had asked the then Viceroy as to what was the reason for so many people dying of hunger. And in his response, he had said, don't worry, these millions would have in any case died. So I didn't do any wrong if I diverted the food for other purposes. I think when the country doesn't draw any lesson from Bengal famine, I think we are in difficult times in the period to come. But more important is, do we have that kind of a strength and resilience to demonstrate that, yes, we have an alternate, or we have an other kind of food system that is possible?
Thanks a lot, Devendra sir. I think you have very well covered a global perspective and a very historical perspective on what are the challenges, and very rightly pointed out on the prioritization, which is not even about feeding the nation. So our priorities could be very different. But I think it would be good to hear from Shri Vijay Kumar ji. I'll quickly introduce and then bring in my question, which is our next panelist, Shri Vijay Kumar ji, ex-officio Special Chief Secretary, who has more than 3 decades of working with the government, and now works on community mobilization, livelihood promotion for rural women, tribal communities, and farmers. He currently leads the movement for climate resilient and community managed natural farming. I think, Vijay ji, if you could talk about some of the success stories of natural farming. AP has been in news for championing natural farming. Could you share that experience? And also a bit about a central and state government view on how, when Andhra Pradesh as a state is moving towards a biodiverse future or a natural farming, what is the kind of resistance that is there or support that is there from the central and state governments?
Yeah. Thank you, Nimisha. And congratulations to your organization for hosting this. Before I answer your question, I also want to go into why without biodiversity, you cannot really have food security or nutrition security. I think the Green Revolution basically simplified nature, into what in a reductionist logic. So soil was seen as a substrate. So therefore, you have to put something into the soil, and then that is feeding the plants. And what science is telling us now, and that is the basis for natural farming, we need to mimic Mother Nature, need to understand how exactly life has come to being. So really, it is photosynthesis, which is the basis for life. Starting from 3.8 billion years ago in the oceans. So photosynthesis is basically pushing carbon from the air into the soil. So what's called as liquid carbon. So the plants are making food. About 60% of it are actually going into the root system or being pushed into the soil. So therefore, in nature, there's a very symbiotic relationship. Plants are feeding the soil, and the soil microbes in turn are providing all the nutrients that a plant requires. So that means that for food and nutrition security, our fields, our farms should have crops throughout the year, what we call as 365 days green cover. And these should be diverse, because diverse crops again are able to signal to diverse microbes. So we had the NPK syndrome, that somehow we have to provide nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium either from a synthetic route or a organic manuring route. But what science tells us that through crop biodiversity and having green cover throughout the year, so you're also creating biodiversity below the ground. And that is the key to ensuring that all plants above ground get all the nutrients. Each plant requires 40, 50, 60 nutrients, some in very trace quantities. And that can only happen if you have a soil covered with diverse living plants. And our experience shows that our productivities are much higher than all the chemicals dumped into a neighboring field. We have 3 crops in a year where only 1 crop would have grown. And each plot of land is capable of having 3 to 5 times what's called as land equivalent ratios. So 1 acre of land is actually producing crops that would normally come in 3 to 5 acres. And all that is happening through a very simple proposition of crop biodiversity, crop geometry, crop associations above ground, and having these living roots throughout the year. So this is at the heart of what natural farming we are advocating. In addition, we also advocate farmers to use their own seeds and indigenous seeds if possible. That's again a separate thing that we need to increase, but own seed, because latest science shows, this is about 10 to 12 years old only, that every seed has its own core microbiome. So the seed is actually carrying the microbiome, and therefore the biodiversity is enhanced by farmers' own seeds if they are generation after generation, if these roots are interacting with biologically active soil. So farmers' own seed is important. Otherwise, the seeds from the market or seeds from the university, they're not really having a good relationship with the microbes in the soil. It'll take a lot of generations. So therefore, our 5th principle in our natural farming is farmers' own seeds. And then we use biostimulants, cow dung-based products, natural products, not as fertilizers. They're not biofertilizers. They're basically to stimulate the microbiology below ground. And the crop biodiversity is also taking care of pest management. So through following principles of nature in a way that farmers understand it, get more money out of it, improve their health, improve soil health, and more important, cool the planet. So it's a win-win-win on so many fronts. And the biggest win being, the farmer is, is able to provide for all creatures on the earth. So there's no distinction, what we call pests. They're not really pests. They're also, creatures. It may look pest to you, but it's a creature. It's food for something else, and it is also having food. And what we discovered is presence of pests is also important to bring out the best in the plants. So many qualities in the plants will not express if the pests are not teasing the plant. So it's not, pest doesn't mean you have to destroy it. So weeds have a role. They also need to live. They also need to be eaten by somebody. So I think a principle of live and let live and providing enough food for everyone is at the heart of a revolution, I would say, grassroots revolution by the farmers, especially women farmers, where their own health is improving, profitability is improving. We are seeing farmers earn 5 to 10 times the money they would have earned in chemical agriculture, not 10%, 15%. I'm not satisfied with that. Our farmers should be prosperous, should be resilient to climate change. And that happens in a very simple process of learning from Mother Nature, respecting it, because the kind of scientific development that are happening are all saying that if you are able to replicate or if you're able to implement these principles, it means greater profitability for farmers, health and nutrition security, and environmental health and resilience to climate change. But technology is one part, but the scaling up, how do you take it? I think I'm told I got less than half a minute, so difficult, but then I'll just finish it in half a minute. The knowledge to me, because we have enrolled about 8.5 lakh farmers, 850,000 farmers in our state by 2023. Our target is 10 lakh farmers this year. And they're 14% of the farmers in Andhra Pradesh. So basically this is happening, A, because of government support, B, because of the network of women self-help groups in Andhra Pradesh, which is more than 20 years old. And really it is the genius of the women, their collectives, the way they are able to internalize this and take it forward in their groups, that is responsible. And third is our extension system is totally democratic, farmer to farmer extension system. And we provide long-term hand-holding support to farmers. So shortage of time, prevents me from saying more about it. Perhaps in some questions it can come up. And thank you very much. But essentially, you cannot have food and nutrition security if you do not have biodiversity, and that is the law of nature. If human beings think they are beyond nature, then, I don't know what the consequences are. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Vijay Kumarji. I think the success story of AP is the hope that we all are looking for. And in some senses, I would like Sarah to come in and sort of bring in the scientific perspective on, why what you are saying makes sense. So just a quick intro for Sarah. Sarah Jones is a scientist at Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIA8. She has co-developed Agrobiodiversity Index, which is a framework and approach for monitoring biodiversity. She's also part of the FABLE consortium, working with 23 countries around the world to develop pathways to sustainable food and land use system. Sarah, I think the panelists before you have given in a great example of what is happening. I think we would like to hear from you solutions and scientific solutions to way forward for biodiverse nation and ensuring food security both at the same time.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for the invitation to talk. And you can skip straight to slide 3. because I wanted to just emphasize something that the previous panelists have also mentioned, which is that agrobiodiversity really sits at the heart of our the challenges that we're talking about. So increasing the range of agrobiodiversity in our food system can contribute to improving nutrition and also to making agriculture more sustainable. And this is really empowering, actually. And so I think that this is something that all of the panelists and hopefully many of the listeners are also using now in how we think about what solutions there are to the food system challenges. And it's something also that we've used in the Agrobiodiversity Index. Namisha, I think I sent you actually a newer slide deck, and don't worry if you don't want to find it now, but you can stop sharing and I'll just talk if unless you find it and you can share again. And so I want to talk a bit about the Agrobiodiversity Index and also what we have learned from applying it in the India context. So we applied it a few years ago in India, and knowing already that the agrobiodiversity context in India was one that was very rich. So India is one of the center of origins of cultivated plants in the world, and it's naturally biodiverse. But at the same time, a lot of this diversity has been lost. And India, of course, is facing a triple burden of a triple nutrition challenge, one where we see malnutrition, undernutrition, and obesity all happening in the same country. And all this to say that it's not easy to find solutions to these kind of wicked challenges or wicked problems, but there are some. And so one of the things that we've learned from applying the index in India is that many of the policies that are currently in existence in the food system, bearing in mind that the food system captures a lot of different elements. It's not just about agriculture, it's also about nutrition policies and land use planning and conservation policies. A lot of them are not including strong targets on agrobiodiversity. So there's an opportunity there to strengthen the way that agrobiodiversity is used as a solution in policy planning and policy setting. And India does, however, have some of the strongest policies in the world with respect to conserving genetic resources for food and agriculture. It has one of the world's largest gene banks, for example, and the policies that are currently in place in India show that there's some strong targets with respect to maintaining the genetic diversity in the gene banks. Unfortunately, this isn't matched by the status, like seeing neglected diversities and breeds represented in food markets. And India also does not currently have a very high level of complexity at the landscape level in agricultural landscapes. And all this means that there's fewer biocontrol services, fewer pollinator services, fewer climate regulation services. And this situation is unlikely to change if the policies are not stronger at the national and the state level. And thanks, Namisha, for finding the slides. And you can flick right through to slide 6, I think it is. Not that one. Go back a little bit, please. Yeah. Okay. No, there's still the old slides, so don't worry. It's fine. It's not a problem to not show them. Okay, so I just have a couple of more points, which are that we know that stronger policies are important, but also it's very difficult to know if those policies are working unless you have good monitoring systems in place to actually track agrobiodiversity. And in this respect, ASHA are doing some very nice work with trying to collate and close data gaps with respect to agrobiodiversity around the country. And we have had a project with ASHA, so the Alliance of Biodiversity and SEAT, over the last few years that has worked to collate data on fish species, for example, and link this to nutritional profiles of fish. And so 4,830 fish species were documented and mapped across the whole of India. And that's useful because then you can start to understand, okay, where is fish diversity flourishing? Where is it floundering? And where can fish be used to contribute more to filling nutrition gaps? Now we're working with the Plant Bureau and the Animal Genetic Resource Bureau to do the same thing for livestock and for crop genetic resources. It's a big task. And I think that actually there's not many countries that are effectively closing their monitoring system, data gaps within their monitoring systems. And it's an important step. And the other kind of success story that I see happening in India, although I just wanted to mention, is that like AICAR and other institutes are using this information that now exists on agrobiodiversity to design more effective interventions. And so one example of that is from a Jeff-funded project that Jai Rana, my colleague, has been leading, which has just ended. And from knowledge of the crop varieties that exist in gene banks and in on farm in some like 8 regions of northern India, it allowed researchers to characterize which were the lost varieties and to reintroduce those lost varieties into a range of promising traits into farms for farmers to then decide which varieties they preferred and found productive in their fields. And that led to 41 land races being reintroduced, which is only a drop in the ocean. There's a lot more land races out there that might be valuable in farm and help address some of the challenges that farmers face at the moment. But it's a great start. And I think it shows promise that, so the project also set up community seed banks. I saw there was some discussion in the chat about those and how important they are. And indeed, it has helped farmers to be able to have better access to locally adapted seeds and to share their seeds. So they're more independent and able to react to future challenges. So my main message is that agrobiodiverse food systems are healthier for people and also for nature. And there's a lot of science now showing this. I didn't have time to really talk much about that, but I can send a long list of papers which prove it. And basically it won't work if we continue on track of using agricultural land solely to produce food for maximum profit. We need agricultural land to produce for climate resilience, produce for closing nutrition gaps, and produce in ways that help sustain biodiversity. So I'm looking forward to seeing what India does on this topic in the future, and I know I'm out of time.
Thanks a lot, everyone. This was indeed very engaging discussion. I wish we had a little bit more time for all of our panelists, but I think a few points that stayed with me through this conversation, one, especially when Kavita started with on how wrong is the conceptualization of food security and nutritional security have been hurting us, and how we need to take a kind of One Health approach and look at soil health being the driver of human well-being and climate resilience. Another interesting point that Devendra sir made was observation on the fact that genetic base has come down drastically. And even though we are the second largest population, we are diverting the food we need to feed our population to the cars. And then we need to basically ask the question again, which is, whose food security are we really talking about? And Shri Vijay Kumar's point on, Green Revolution kind of taking a reductionist paradigm. So while there have been amazing results mimicking Mother Nature, focusing on soil health, farmers using their own seed, we are in some senses pushed to reimagine the role every component that plays in farming, whether it's pests or weed, the philosophy of live and let live, and how that has been economically beneficial as well. And finally, Sarah, you talking about the triple nutrition challenge of malnutrition, undernutrition, and obesity, all are, not being looked at, while the Agrobiodiversity Index as a scientific way forward does talk about including these parameters. And also, thank you for bringing in India-specific data points and examples. I'm sure many people in the audience would be interested to go through the research. A topic like this is too vast, too layered to be covered in one roundtable. But I hope that we have some time for a few questions. Thank you, Kavita, for answering some of the questions that our members posed. But we'll take one or two quick questions. We are going to request all the panel. We are going to send a list of questions to all our panelists. If you have time, please do answer so that we can send it back to people who have attended. Let's look at some of the questions that we have. We have about 25 questions, and I don't think so we'll be able to answer all of them. So how about the... I think there is a question which is, can we have an accurate information on why people are hungry? Is it because shortage of food, distribution? DS is stating there is a shortage. Oh, sorry, but sorry. So is it actually true? I think the question is for Devendra sir.
Okay, if you look at the global situation, we have today 8 billion people on the planet, and the food that we produce today is good enough to feed 13 billion people. Now, for 8 billion, we are already producing food for 13 billion. 13 billion is not expected to be the requirement at the end of the century. So this kind of food that we are producing now, the question that arises is then why, a large population or a significant population goes to bed hungry every night? It is because of the issue of access and distribution. Some people are eating more, some people are eating less. We also know that, globally, about a third of the food that we produce is lost or is wasted. So, and the entire effort, in my understanding, should be how to save on that kind of food wastage, rather than focusing more on the same kind of intensive farming system or more of the same kind of approach that we have been following. So there is no shortage of food in the world, and I think we need to adopt adequate policies to ensure how we can have diverse kind of agriculture all across the world.
There is shortage of good food.
Yes, definitely. I think another question, Vijayji, if you could take, is that how can a farmer from the market can build a successful farming with diverse farming? I think you touched upon when you were talking about it, but if you could just quickly take this question again.
You see, 86% of our farmers are small and marginal farmers. So our perspective is essentially from small and marginal farmers' perspective. And we find that quite a lot of them go into their own consumption basket, their own family, neighbors, and the whatever is the crop which goes to the market, even if it's sold at the same price, they don't lose anything because they're producing more, and they're also producing diverse kind of crops, and they get incomes every month. And we have many thousands of cases where this thing is happening, and people can come see that. So it's not theory, it is actually happening on a very large scale. So it's not really an issue. If somebody is looking at a farmer with 20 acres, 50 acres, how are they going to manage diverse crops and all that, then it's a problem. But we decided that we will look at this 86% who are small and marginal. They are the ones who are really in need of livelihood security, food security. And we are saying that every farmer should earn income every month, not once a year, every month. So money coming from diverse crops, and their food basket, food plate, every day should be diverse. So it's possible.
So if I may just get in, I'm sorry, Nimisha. I
Sure,
recently
definitely.
met a woman farmer in Tirupati as part of the APCNF program. Every second day, she's selling vegetables and earning 1,500 to 2,000 rupees, including to some consumers in her village she aggregates from others and sells in the neighboring town. So if we really want to talk about localized food systems, you have to begin with diversity. The minute you have the same commodity being grown by everyone, you will have no option but to look for distant markets. So even for localized food systems that we all dream about, you need diversity with each farmer that you work with.
That's
And
thank you.
diversity over time, so that
Yes.
every month you get different foods, and so that's also reason why you're healthy.
I think that's a very important point, Vijayji, on having like diversity across the year and not thinking of diversity only in terms of like intercropping or a few crops. So that's a very interesting point. I think there is one, we would take this as the last question, which is, what does the farmers take on these issues, yield versus diversity? So I guess, Kavita, Vijayji, if you could just bring in, what do farmers feel about yield versus diversity?
No, we are talking of yield and diversity. Higher yield and diversity, there is no contradiction. It is how well the farmers are able to understand the soil, the need for diversity, and it's very easy to do that.
Sure. I think we'll take one last question, which is that currently there is a surge going on in India for adoption of millets, but then we see that many states millet missions are focusing on one or two major millets. Wouldn't it have the same monoculture farming, because we are losing many land races of other minor millets which have many aspects of benefits themselves? I think this is an important, this thing that happened with rice, with wheat, and now is happening with millet. So any comments?
So sorry, Vijayji, after you.
No, we are encouraging intercrops within millets. So I'm not only worried about, only millets, I'm also worried that intercrops, we are having pulses, oil seeds within millets, and then also having multiple millets in the similar plot of land. Some as border crops, some as intercrops. So absolutely, I agree. We should not have any, monocropping even in millets. I mean, then you are in the same same downhill race as happened with rice and wheat.
I wanted to add that the best example of millets is actually Odisha Millets Mission, and there we find that the land races are performing so well that some scientists are wondering whether one is going wrong with the crop cutting experiments that have been conducted. And that is a state where, for the first time in India, a seed release committee at the state level has been created for traditional varieties. Usually the varietal release committees at the state or the central level are about improved, so-called improved varieties that come from the research system. But Odisha has just set up a committee which will release traditional varieties. And they're talking about diverse millet varieties within each crop of millet.
Thanks a lot, Kavita. Sarah, we would...
Just a minute, Nimisha.
Sorry.
I want to chip in here. I think the example that Kavita gave us about traditional varieties being, part of the program in Odisha, I think is very important, because, let us not commit the same mistake with millets that we did with rice and wheat or with other crops. Because when you increase productivity, when we talk of improved varieties coming in, we are basically aiming at increasing productivity, which means the nutrition goes down. Now, millets are being promoted because of its inherent strength of nutrients. And if you were to bring in improved varieties where the nutrition goes down, then what is the difference between millets or wheat or for other crops for that matter? So I think we have to be very careful and selective that we do not encourage, improved varieties. And we know so many of hybrids that have been evolved have actually low nutrition ability. It has been demonstrated. ICRISAT and other institutes have shown that their nutrition has come down. So I think let's be very, very careful in selecting the improved varieties over the traditional varieties.
Thanks a lot, Devinder ji, for adding that perspective. Sarah, any last comments? The questions that came in, would you like to respond?
Well, there was one question which was very good one on organic farming, and that would that be a problem if India was to shift entirely to organic? And it's true that there are often yield losses when farms shift from conventional to organic, unless there's diversity on also incorporated into the transition process. So the key really seems to be including diversity and moving away from monocultures so that you can have natural ways of controlling your pests and replenishing soil nutrients when you're reducing synthetic inputs. So I think, yeah, agrobiodiversity is the key.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, because there is always this conversation, organic farming will not give us those kind of yield, but including diversity is the solution. And with that, I think I would like to bring it to a close and ask Ravi for a vote of thanks.
Thanks, everyone. I think this can be an ongoing conversation for several more hours, maybe gives us enough ideas to start inviting each of the panelists for an hour-long session, kind of give a lecture and a follow-up discussion. So I want to thank the four panelists, Sarah Jones, Kavitha Kuruganti, Vijay Kumar, and Devinder Sharma, for accepting our invitation, for giving their thoughts, engaging with the audience. We did very well with the audience. At one point of time, I saw more than 180 people attending the webinar. I think that was quite good, including Dr. Kamal Bawa, very early morning for him in Boston, Massachusetts. And it's taken us some time and effort to put this together, to get the panelists on board, to frame the questions, to create the creatives, do the social media engagement, get people to know about these issues. So I'm very thankful to my colleagues in the team, Aninda Ghosh, Aditi Sajwan, Nimisha, who also moderated today's discussion, and to social media, and Prathama Gavai, and to social media interns, Dhruv and Lisa, who've been running our social media campaigns. And finally, but not the last, I want to thank our supporter, Roni Nilkini Philanthropies, who's been supporting the Biodiversity Collaborative for over a year now. And we've also been working with government institutions. Thank you very much. Good evening to all of you.